My accountability dream is that this mechanism will actually also look at the violations and allegations of abuse and war crimes by international forces.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So there have been a few kind of indications I've been spotting in recent months that accountability for what's been happening in Afghanistan is, surprisingly, considering how much else is going on in the world, is still actually reasonably high on the international agenda.
Yeah, we saw a couple of signs of those. Let me guess, maybe, to see what you've come up with.
Okay, what do you think? What's your first suggestion?
Well, the first thing is there was, of course, this establishment of this new international independent inquiry mechanism set up out of Geneva.
Yes, we've seen different ones. I mean, the first one, the original version, the OG, is Syria. Then we had Myanmar. We've had a different style of one, the UNITAD one, which died a rather ignominious death. We've still got to explore what's happened with all of that at some point. We have seen this being an idea that keeps on taking off in Geneva. I think we've had one settled on the DRC, but I haven't heard sight nor sound of actually what's happening there. And now we have an Afghanistan one. And apart from that, what else have you noticed, Steph?
Well, I think you've warned, and I saw in my inbox as well, there's been a special tribunal, one of those people's tribunals, a women's tribunal, I think even, maybe?
Yes, that's right. This is a subject that we've done previously, how these people's tribunals are set up, often by NGOs, but they are given a kind of a formality by having judges, by having a prosecution. You know, there's ups and downs about them, but this was happening last month, and it looked, I thought, particularly interesting to see exactly what kind of evidence they were bringing, because I can imagine that kind of being the same kind of evidence that we might hear in other processes. And to discuss these and maybe some other opportunities for accountability, we've asked Shaharzad Akbar to join us. Hi, Shaharzad.
Hi, Janet. Hi, Steph. Very good to be with both of you.
So your organisation, Shaharzad Rawadari, is one of those who helped create, sponsor, get involved behind the scenes with this women's tribunal. Can you explain, I don't know, let's start, what's in it for you? Why would you want to do one of these kind of things?
Thank you, Janet. Well, we had the idea of People's Tribunal for a while now, organizing a People's Tribunal for Afghanistan. And we finally had the hearing sessions for People's Tribunal for Women of Afghanistan in October in Madrid, Spain. The idea was there because we felt like survivors are missing from a lot of the discussions about what's happening in Afghanistan. Their voices are missing. And the formal procedures are good, important. You know, we have an ongoing International Criminal Court investigation in Afghanistan. We have a potential case at the International Court of Justice, or initiative for a potential case. You spoke about the investigative mechanism earlier. These are important processes. They're often slow, they're lengthy, and often there's not a very public role for the survivors. So we really wanted to center women of Afghanistan, particularly because women of Afghanistan are being silenced and erased inside Afghanistan by the Taliban. This was the kind of initial thinking behind it. But of course, people's tribunals also can support formal processes. You know, they can bring evidence forward that can be utilized by formal processes, formal investigations. They can encourage investigations if they don't exist in cases. That's not the case in Afghanistan. We do have multiple accountability avenues right now, but perhaps some of the evidence, some of the findings from there could be utilized, but also the judgment itself, once it comes out, it's not a formal binding document, but it can be used as a tool for advocacy by civil society. It can be a sort of advocacy roadmap.
We've seen these kind of people's tribunals before, and there's no defense or somebody arguing kind of on the side of the defense. So you say that it can be useful to future prosecutions, but we tend to see that it's not used very much in a kind of formal legal setting. So what makes it worth it then to still set up? Because I assume there's lots of time and money and effort and also kind of emotion put into these kind of tribunals.
Absolutely. Just one point on the defense, because this was held under the Permanent People's Tribunal, which is a semi-formal body in Rome. They did send the indictment, which was prepared by 4 Afghan prosecutors. It was a 64-page document, but they sent the indictment to the accused, which is the Taliban, in September, in advance of the hearing session. The Taliban never responded. We know Taliban never respond to these things. They don't engage with international law. They don't engage with international accountability mechanisms. But during the days of the hearings, the judges multiple times called on, is there any representation from the de facto authorities in this room? Would anyone like to speak up? And at the end, in the agenda, there was time slotted for them. So it was very important for us, for the legitimacy of this process, credibility of it, for the Taliban to be given an opportunity to defend themselves. They didn't take the opportunity. But yes, they are huge endeavors. They are, not cost efficient. They can raise expectations because people might think, oh, is this a formal process? Will someone go to jail? I mean, the indictment names 10 Taliban leaders and the Taliban as a group and state of Afghanistan. So there are those limitations. But I think for us, the People's Tribunal's audience was not just the international community and the International Criminal Court, it was also the people of Afghanistan. It was really important because Taliban are also really trying to normalize their crimes. It was really important. So we put a lot of effort into live streaming the tribunal and having Afghan media in exile covering it. So one of the TVs were covering, one of the kind of most viewed TVs inside Afghanistan was covering it live, to have a lot of analysis and writing about it in local languages. And the fact that these women were speaking about their experiences in such an open way, that I think was of value itself.
What kind of testimonies then were women giving? Because I think all of us are aware that things are very, very difficult for women in Afghanistan. Lack of education, probably lack of access to services, lack of access to public spaces. But what more specifically were women talking about?
So we had, as per the indictment, the prosecutors had gender persecution. They had also talked about inhuman acts of the Rome Statute, as well as the right to life, right to education, right to employment. So the witnesses were, those who were testifying, were each related to one of the aspects of these violations. So we had testimonies about detention and torture and harassment. We have testimonies about violations of the right to health, to education. We had testimonies from women with disability and how these restrictions are particularly impacting women with disability in their right to movement, their right to health, their right to education. So we had 24 women testifying, some from inside, some from outside. A lot of security issues, of course, especially for those from inside. So we had less in-person testimonies because people, even survivors in the Europe, were hesitant about testifying in person because they have family members inside Afghanistan. We had a survivor in the room who was in the room, but she testified with her, not with her real name, and in audio because she was so anxious about her immediate family. In Afghanistan, we had survivors testify in person, but their faces were covered with masks. So there was a lot of security measures that we had to take. And this happened when there was an internet shutdown in Afghanistan. So we had difficulty reaching survivors to record their testimonies. And one of the survivors, she traveled for 1.5 hours to Afghanistan's border with Iran. She bought an Iranian SIM card and tried to connect with us to send her testimony. So this was really, for us, I think for me, the most important people and the most important thing about this process was really the survivors, the women of Afghanistan.
And you talk about kind of practical difficulties. I find it amazing that you found people inside of Afghanistan talking to you and giving this testimony. There was all the practical problems of getting them to testify. How tough is it kind of emotionally and culturally for those women to speak out?
It's incredibly difficult. I mean, we had, in a way, all of us, including the 4 Afghan organizations who are organizing this, because of decades of war and crimes in Afghanistan, we are all survivors. So it was a very emotional and emotionally heavy process for all of us, for all the Afghan women in the room. The prosecutors, one of the prosecutors, she's a prominent Afghan human rights defender. She's a person with disability. She had to walk out during the proceedings because she became so emotional listening to the testimonies of women with disability. It was a very emotionally heavy process for us. We had 2 mental health specialists on site to help with everyone, to help and offer help if people needed help. But I think that the outside was hard also, because as testimonies went on social media, as people were watching on TV, there was a huge degree of, especially for the ones who talked very openly about like being called a prostitute by the Taliban or being touched or being, harassed. There was a whole level of victim shaming, right? Like, if you were a good woman, this wouldn't happen to you. So that's also the cultural context. And that cultural context for women to come out and to talk about these things, to talk about being grabbed from their home or from the street by men who are not related to them, being taken into Taliban custody and spending time there and being harassed while there and being stripped naked and photos of them being taken. I don't know if I could testify like that if that had happened to me. I mean, it requires incredible courage because you lose family members, you lose relatives won't speak to you, people think you brought shame to them. So it really was an act of courage by everyone who testified, even those who had changed their names, just talking about some very difficult experiences, who are also like concepts of cultural shaming and all of that. It required a lot of courage, yes.
So I think, as you've already mentioned, Shaharzad, we are still going to be waiting for a judgment coming from the tribunal probably by the end of the year. But if we kind of move on from there to some of the other different mechanisms that we're speaking about, the first one I just wanted to, I think you've already mentioned it already, the International Court of Justice. That's also a gender-related, women's rights-related issue. It's under a particular UN convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Maybe we could do a quick Stephopedia on that case. Steph, I assume it's one of the ones that you're following before we follow up.
It is one of the ones I'm following, and it recently got in the news in the Netherlands. What happened is that in September 2024, Australia, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands formally called on Afghanistan to cease what the countries say are violations of the CEDAW convention. So they are discriminating against women when they shouldn't because they signed this convention. And they have signaled that this is kind of the starting process for these countries to file a case with the ICJ. And this is supported by another 22 states, and they're trying to hold the Taliban accountable for these human rights breaches of women and girls since they seized power in 2021. And if the dispute does go to the ICJ, it will be the first time a country has been summoned to the International Court of Justice for discrimination against women. This recently became news again in the Netherlands because the Dutch Immigration Service has judged that 2 women can be sent back to Afghanistan because they can't show that they wouldn't be able to adjust to essentially Taliban repression. And of course, Dutch lawyers and advocates for Afghan women made a big point of, you are starting this case for discrimination. It's obvious that there is this discrimination, and you're sending these women back with the argument that, well, you can probably get used to it. This seems a very slow moving process getting to the ICJ. What do states tell you, Shaharzad, about their intentions of this case? Will it actually make it, or are they hoping that the Taliban will suddenly kind of change its ways and be nice to women and they can drop this case?
Well, actually not much. The states are not very transparent, and I think partly because they are white, because Afghan civil society has made a lot of noise. When the initiative was announced, we had some specific demands in terms of transparency and consultation. Again, at the anniversary this year, in September 2025, we said, okay, it has been 1 year, what are you doing? And there are legitimate fears from the Afghan civil society that that this process will be used as a bargaining chip with the Taliban, especially with Germany at the lead, because Germany recently allowed Taliban diplomats to come and operate from inside Germany to ease deportations. They are very big on deportations of Afghans. They have already deported Afghan men back to Afghanistan. But of course, always starts somewhere and then expands. And initially also Afghan human rights community had concerns about Germany being in the lead because of Germany's position on Gaza and this hypocrisy, and how that might look with the community. So they're not saying much. when we get snippets of information from the states, it seems like there's not a lot of coordination between the four. It does seem like with the former foreign minister of Germany leaving, Annalena, that there is less energy and momentum. So we are actually quite concerned that this might take a very long time and that they might have the four states might have different expectations. Like Netherlands might want to use it more to try to get to reverse some of the restrictions on women, like women's right to education, which would be insufficient. All these rights are interrelated. Germany may have other intentions. Right now, it doesn't seem, unfortunately, very promising. Something that seemed promising and something potentially historic, not just for Afghanistan, but for women's rights and gender justice, now doesn't seem as promising. So we're also looking at, can we recruit other states to do parallel cases? Is that a possibility?
Well, you've got this long list of 22 states who are meant to be supporting it in addition. So who's your best candidate?
Well, we are interested in Spain, and if Spain would be willing, also able to convince a Muslim majority country to join as well, because there are multiple Muslim majority countries who are signatories to CEDAW and Article 29, which would allow them to, for instance, Bangladesh. There are others as well. So yes, I think Spain has a better standing among Muslim majority countries also because of Gaza, because these cases can take forever, as you know. The message that we want to send to people is not just the legal process. The message that we want to go to the Taliban is that the world is standing with women of Afghanistan and against you for the violations of their rights. And countries from across the world, including Muslim countries, are calling you out for this behavior. That's the message that we want to go very clearly. And it's hard to send that message right now.
One of the other mechanisms that we heard of is this new IIM, or IIMA, which was just announced in Geneva. I mean, this is another one of these initiatives, and international funding or funding just generally for international law is hard to get by since the US kind of drastically changed its priorities, shall we say. Do you have any insight in that mechanism and the funding for it and how and when this might get going and what it could do?
Well, from what we hear, there is some small movement, like discussions about the TOR for the mechanism and what it might look like. For us in the Afghan human rights community, the priority is to get funding for it, to push for funding for it, so that it doesn't remain on paper. We have been fighting for over 4 years for this mechanism. And then also the way it is set up and who leads it, because it's very important that it has an added value. And what I mean by added value is that it also looks at perpetrators other than the Taliban. One of the reasons this mechanism got so delayed was because US was constantly blocking it, because they were worried that it would look into violations of their own forces in Afghanistan. My dream is that, my accountability dream is that this mechanism will actually also look at the violations and allegations of abuse and war crimes by international forces. Now, that's a very ambitious, request in this political environment, but we are heartened by the fact that the mechanism was supported by different countries. It was the resolution passed by consensus, and that we got some strong support, for instance, from South Africa as well. If it is funded, we hope that it will be funded and operational soon, and then that it will have a truly comprehensive mandate as it is supposed to do, and that it will not, again, deprioritize everyone but the Taliban, because I think that's not added value, frankly.
Since you've already raised the idea of comprehensive investigations and institutions that are meant to take that broader picture, maybe we should bring in under this the International Criminal Court, which is another major accountability mechanism. Arrest warrants came out against 2 individuals this year. Let me just turn to Steph briefly to give the quick Stephopedia version of who, what, where, when.
In July this year, the ICC judges issued arrest warrants for the Taliban Supreme Leader and the Chief Justice. They are charged with crimes against humanity and then specifically prosecution on gender grounds. That includes not only women and girls, but also members of the LGBTQ plus community. We need to also say that, because Shaharzad, you spoke about this deprioritization, that the ICC has investigated Afghanistan for a very long time, but I want to say in 2021, I'm not entirely sure of the year, prosecutor announced that he would deprioritize cases against international forces and including US soldiers, something that was included before, and he would focus on the Taliban and ISIS-K cases. And so that is what he's doing, and that is why also kind of the accountability path for possible crimes committed by international forces doesn't seem to be the ICC at the moment.
I mean, you've said that you consider it potentially your dream to actually see a really comprehensive investigation. You must feel disappointed, at least, that the ICC is not that space that you had assumed it was going to be. Is what they are doing, though, to actually target these two, the most senior people in Afghanistan in the Taliban authorities? I mean, does that make sense to you as an approach for the moment?
When ICC made the announcement that they fired the investigation in Afghanistan, then they resumed the investigation in Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover, and then there was the announcement from the prosecutor about deprioritizing other perpetrators and focusing on Taliban and the Islamic State in Afghanistan. It was a disappointing moment because survivors had been looking forward to an ICC investigation for a long time in a context of, ongoing impunity, and particularly when the really powerful were not being held accountable. So it was a disappointing moment. That said, I think the Afghanistan team in the ICC is extremely committed. They have been really trying to reach out to the Afghan civil society. It's great. It's really reaffirming and encouraging to see the arrest warrants for the Taliban leaders. Yes, we may not see them in court anytime soon, but it was, I remember at the exact moment, the announcement about the issuance of the arrest warrants was made by the prosecutor's office in January 2025. We were in a room with Afghan civil society leaders for an event on ICG, in fact, and everyone was crying because it was unbelievable that finally we may have a glimpse of justice, finally. So it is meaningful in that sense, but it is limited, right? Which is why I think this investigative mechanism, which is why we still hope to see more and broadening of the scope from the ICC, but we know all the financial issues and the political pressures, and which is why also this investigative mechanism, it's very important that it complements these efforts and it does create an avenue for victims who currently feel excluded from accountability mechanisms on Afghanistan.
It's quite narrow, though, the actual specifics of what the judges agreed to in the arrest warrants on these specific crimes. Incredibly important, as we've already heard, what is happening in terms of gender in Afghanistan, but there are an awful lot of other crimes. There are arrests, there have been massacres, there's torture. I mean, do you worry that somehow that survivors themselves have that sense of, why not me? Why aren't I included here?
Yes, that's definitely the case. I mean, this is there is, unfortunately, because of decades of impunity in Afghanistan, there is a wide area of survivors who feel excluded from the current accountability mechanisms, including the ICC investigation. As you said, the scope is very limited with these ones. But from recent conversations with them, we know that they are considering of thinking of broadening the scope in a sense. But again, with the International Criminal Court, as you both know better than me, you just get a few arrest warrants. So it's one thing, but it's complementary, and you really need other avenues to justice to make sure that the diverse area of survivors have access to some form of accountability. And that's why I think it's also important to hold these countries accountable for allegations about their own forces. What's going on in Australia in terms of the investigation of the alleged abuses in war crimes in Afghanistan. UK, not so great. There has been so many attempts at cover-up. US, people tell me there is no hope, but I still have hope that one day the US military will also be held accountable, possibly in a people's tribunal, possibly by a coalition of civil society organizations from different parts of the world where the US has started wars and then left them or engaged in civilian harm. So there must be accountability. I think all survivors need to see themselves in these processes in some way.
Talking about other avenues for accountability, we have to talk, of course, about universal jurisdiction cases. The last one that we saw was the one in the Netherlands in 2022. They had a conviction on torture in prisons, but that was overturned on appeal last year, actually on a technicality, because judges said on appeal that there was no nexus to the armed conflict. So the charge of torture as a war crime couldn't be held. It was appealed to the Supreme Court, but the suspect died in the meantime. Are there any other ongoing universal jurisdiction case, and what does the kind of maybe fragility of this case say about universal jurisdiction cases and how hard it is to have those?
Well, I can only speak about the perspective of the Afghan human rights community. We are not very well resourced or trained to utilize universal jurisdiction at the moment, but it is one of the tools that we are looking at more and more. Particularly also, I talked about the international military, but I should also talk about the former republic officials and individuals in the former republic who there are allegations of serious violations and crimes about them, who some of them now live in the West. So there's a possibility of pursuing accountability in those cases through universal jurisdiction. Where we are is trying to really honestly learn more, at least in Awadori with our colleagues. We are planning several exposure trainings on universal jurisdiction this year, but I know that there's more and more talk of this in the Afghan human rights community and trying to learn from the experience of our Syrian colleagues to see what are some of their lessons learned and how we would be guided. Of course, it's different, but how we would be guided by some of the successes that they have had with universal jurisdiction.
Well, we've done a big gallop there, Shaharzad, through an awful lot of our world, represented very briefly, but through the lens of Afghanistan. I mean, obviously, you're not the only person in the Afghan human rights community, so you can't speak on behalf of everybody. But I'm wondering whether you feel that with all of these avenues, but nothing actually sort of concretely happening in each case, apart from maybe some testimonies being brought forward, maybe a little bit of public exposure, but actual cases, how frustrated are you by the situation?
I'm extremely frustrated, to be honest, because I think on the one hand, the most difficult part of our work is talking to people in Afghanistan, right? Because making sense of what these processes mean for them, all these mighty institutions, these fancy processes, and still girls are not going to school. Still women are banned from going to work. Still there are restrictions on movement, and they are getting worse. So the big question, I guess, all of us is, can accountability deter? Can accountability prevent crimes from happening? And we are not seeing much of that in the context of Afghanistan. Despite the arrest warrants, for instance, we are not seeing the Taliban leaders stopping and taking a moment and thinking, oh, should we go on this path if this means that we might one day be held accountable by the International Criminal Court? And that's extremely frustrating. That's really draining because we are, as a human rights community, invested on these accountability mechanisms, which is why I think sometimes we have to stop and think, accountability, yes, important aspect of our work, important for mobilizing hope, preserving hope, and sending this message that these are crimes, these are not normal, these happen, and also holding these institutions and states accountable to actually follow through. But it is just a portion of the work. There's a much bigger aspect of the work that needs to happen in order to make change happen on the ground. And to what extent can we use these accountability processes to create some cohesion in the international community's response to Afghanistan, to look at the Taliban and say, look, we'll no longer tolerate this level of discrimination against women, and this will have real implications for our business with you, for our meetings with you, for our normalization. The challenge, Janet, is that we see the normalization happening, right? So in July, we have the arrest warrants. In July, we have Russia becoming the first country to recognize the Taliban. So sometimes when we talk to women in Afghanistan, they ask us, what's the point? And it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't want to simplify that. But I think when you are in a very desperate and difficult situation, you also want to use every platform. For me, as a defender, it's about, I'm going to fight Taliban misogyny and tyranny and oppression in every battlefront, in every court, every mechanism, every little pathway, formal or informal. I'll just do all I can to not allow this to be normalized. Maybe we'll succeed, maybe we'll fail, but we must not bow down to this and accept this to continue.
Thank you. I think that's a very clear mission statement for you of why you're doing this. We want to thank you for talking to us about all of these things in this super quick bird's eye view of accountability in Afghanistan. We always ask at the end of our podcast our asymmetrical haircuts questions. And I think you've probably already answered what is the important thing you want to highlight. So I'm going to move on to the next asymmetrical haircuts question. And it's kind of, what is the oddest job you have had?
The oddest job, like as a
Yes.
Maybe also functioning as a piece of advice to others to say that career paths aren't always exactly straight. They can go slightly curvy.
Well, I was a journalist for BBC Afghanistan. This was one of the first jobs. When I turned 18, I became a journalist for BBC Afghanistan for 9 months. It was a very exciting job, and everyone in Afghanistan knows Liz Doucet. I don't know if your listeners know her, but for me, I just imagined like becoming like her one day. But then I quickly realized I'm very passionate about specific issues to remain objective. So maybe journalism is not the path for me. But yeah, that was one of the unusual jobs I had, I guess.
And our other question we ask at the end, is there anything you'd like to recommend to people that you're watching, listening to, or reading at the moment? It can be within the field or something that you're using to get away from the field. What's on your nightstand at the moment?
So I listen to a lot of parenting podcasts because I have 2 sons, 6 and 3, and I think listening to parenting podcasts in a way for me is to sort of get away from the challenges of my work, the heartbreak of my work, but also to regain some sense of control. Like, okay, maybe at home with the kids, I have some I can do some things to see some immediate impact.
And which are the ones that you recommend? Which are the ones you like specifically?
I am currently listening to The Good Inside with Dr. Becky.
We'll link to that in our show notes. I remember when we did the episode on counting casualties, one of the women on there recommended a parenting podcast for parents of neurodiverse children like myself. And I still listen to that podcast. I greatly enjoy it. So you never know where you're getting the best recommendations for all the things that we struggle with apart from work, or that we enjoy apart from work.
Well, I'm actually reading. I wanted to tell you about what I'm reading too, but I'm nervous a little bit because I'm reading The Mega Doctrine by Charlie Kirk, which is strange choice, but I'm trying to understand this rise in right-wing politics and what does it mean for human rights. So I guess from that perspective, it is related to my work. But
Understood. Not a recommendation, but an insightful choice. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Shaharzad. Really appreciated. I think we'll have to put a lot of links to a lot of previous podcasts. And you've been on the show before talking about the different mechanisms for accountability for foreign forces in Afghanistan. And we've done a whole series on that. So we'll add this to our store of podcasts in this area. And thank you so much for spending some time this afternoon to explain this to us, what's actually going on at the moment.
thank you. Thank you both. It was lovely speaking to you both.
Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.
Just to say, you can also support this podcast. Check out our supporters page, and there you'll find details of our Patreon and our newsletter.
Yeah, if you haven't had enough of us chatting about war crimes and making inappropriate jokes, then go over to Patreon, where you can get extra bonus content where Janet and I run our own War Criminals book club. We read books about war criminals. We don't commit our own.
And it's just the price of a cup of coffee. So see you there.